Hi everyone. In this presentation, we'll be taking a closer look at the mRNA COVID-19 vaccine. Now, quick disclaimers before we get started. These are things I would just like to ask you to keep in mind throughout the presentation. Hopefully, they will help you get the most out of this presentation. First thing to mention is that this presentation alone is not sufficient as a sole source of information. You are required to do your homework, and anything that leaves you scratching your head, anything that you're curious about, or things that you doubt. You know, I can't think of everything that you might think of, so you cannot rely on this presentation alone. The second thing I'd like to disclaim is that I'm not an anti-vaxxer in any way. I fully believe in the mechanism of action in which vaccines work, the way that traditional vaccines have worked anyways. We're gonna learn about this new kind of vaccine pretty soon, but the way that traditional vaccines have worked with the whole, you insert the inactive virus or bacteria in the bloodstream, then the antigens are recognized, antibodies are made. I get that whole thing. Full believer in it. Totally works. We've obviously noticed that some illnesses like polio and smallpox have been eradicated. Let's thank vaccines for that, right? So in no way am I an anti-vaxxer. And lastly, the information in this presentation is presented as is. If of course I'll try my best to leave out any sort of political ideologies or inclinations, or try to leave out as much bias as possible. I'm simply trying to get some information out there, and it's really up to you what you do with it. If you feel like having an emotional reaction and shutting your ears the whole time, or just closing it off, it ends up being a waste of time, or you spend no time on this at all, and that's up to you. However, if you do try to listen to it from beginning to end with a sharp eye, you might get something out of it. So really, that's all I have to disclaim for now. So here's the official narrative. This is really the elephant in the room, the thing everybody's talking about, the obvious, really. And this portion of the video, just like in every video on this channel, there's an official narrative and then there's a counter narrative. So the official narrative is the one that pretty much everybody's heard of through mainstream media, our governments, health authorities, all that stuff. And then the counter narrative originates as the yin to the yang, right? As the opposite, the opposite standing points of the official narrative. So without further ado, there's a global epidemic, right? It's pretty much, there's this novel coronavirus that induces symptoms in people that are listed as COVID-19. It's spread to virtually every country in the world. It's dangerous and much worse than the flu. Some statistics reporting that it's up to 10 times more deadly than the flu, or even worse in some cases. So really, it's something not to be taken lightly. At the same time, while all this is going on, there's very extensive testing, keeping track of the number of cases, keeping track of the number of associated deaths to it, and this is all available online through the Johns Hopkins website, through the news. I mean, sometimes you just see a little square for the lady that's talking. You got these big numbers all around the screen. So this is all the stuff that's going on. This is really the obvious here. Now, as part of this global problem, there's been a global response, right, to try and dampen the blow, right? We've had national lockdowns around the world, right? So we've got countries like the United States, you've got Canada, you've got European countries, you've got countries all over Africa and Asia. All these places, lockdowns have been imposed upon many businesses. Now, there's of course a few exceptions, like some industries have been considered essential, or if you can work from home, then you're also not going to be shut down. But a huge portion of businesses and the non-essential services have been closed. And if you still are open and you have a physical location, mask wearing is mandatory, social distancing is required. So there's all kinds of restrictions, even to the businesses that were allowed to stay open. Now, not only have industries and businesses been affected, but even for individuals or employees who want to travel, restrictions have been imposed. And that can include travel to another state, travel to even another town within a state or a province, and definitely to another country. And often quarantines are imposed if you are allowed to travel upon return or upon arrival at your destination. And all of these measures are necessary for a positive outcome given the global crisis. However, this global response has had global consequences, right? We've seen the global economy tank, right? We've seen people lose their jobs in huge numbers and continue to do. We've seen record-breaking drops in GDP in even wealthy countries like the United States. Non-urgent medical treatments have been postponed to allow hospitals to be full capacity for treatment of COVID. And this has also had some inadvertent consequences because some of the non-urgent stuff is hindering people's quality of life, or some illnesses are not going diagnosed because people would rather stay home, or the hospital is simply not making those kinds of appointments anymore. There's been a drop in the global production of goods overall. And of course, in a lot of ways, demand has also dropped because the amount of activity we're doing has gone down. But, a lot of things, a lot of meatpacking plants, wood mills and all kinds of, means of production have been closed. So we're going to see an increase in prices in some kind of way as soon as demand starts to go back up and production lags behind. So these are all consequences that that people are seeing and experiencing firsthand that have derived from the global response to the global crisis. And something I would like to note is that there have been national-wide moratoriums on mortgage and loan payments. So this means that unlike in 2008, when we really got to see the pain and the damage caused by the economic downturn, this time it's being a little sugar-coated because, if you look at the statistics, about 16% of mortgages in Canada have had their payments deferred. Imagine if these people didn't have the option to defer their payments. Would they be insolvent? Would they be unable to make the payments because of the job they lost or their hours being cut? Think of all the people that would have lost their home or their business or their car had these moratoriums not been imposed during this time, right? So a lot of people have experienced the damage firsthand. It's already been pretty bad. But imagine if we didn't have these moratoriums in place to soften the blow. So really, there have been a lot of consequences to these lockdowns. So, we know about the global crisis. We've implemented some not really a solution. It's been more of a response to try and dampen the blow. We're now living the consequences of those measures. So now comes the global solution, right? And this is a hot topic now. It's the vaccine. It's the COVID-19 vaccine. And essentially, here's the way it goes, right? The threat and severity of the COVID-19 virus has warranted the lockdowns, right? And even though the lockdowns are bad, it's not as bad as losing lives, right? That's the idea. The idea is that the economy's tanking and the damage done to the economies come and go, right? They go up and they go down, but once somebody dies, they're not coming back, right? So I think most people are willing to put aside the damage done to the economy in favor of a better outcome for the pandemic. So we won't have a lockdown cure until there's a COVID cure, right? Because trying to dampen the blow of COVID has brought about the lockdowns, then as long as the lockdowns are less bad than the pandemic itself, then we won't see the lockdowns go away till the pandemic has been addressed. And that's going to require some kind of COVID cure. Now, this, you can do like a little deduction here. And what that's saying is that the lockdowns will continue, right, until a COVID cure is put into place, right? And that includes herd immunity, right? Herd immunity is a COVID cure. However, that's going to take a while, right? If we want to get out of these lockdowns soon, we have to bring about a COVID cure. What's being talked about a lot is a COVID vaccine, right? And if for whatever reason we do not comply with this cure, we don't take it in mass numbers, then we'll be to blame for the continued lockdowns because we're all in this together. We're all in this COVID boat. We're all in this situation. And collectively, our actions will determine the outcome collectively. So I think I've sort of touched on the obvious. I think this is about what most people know, and this is 90% of the knowledge I would say you need to see the full picture. Right? We're really close. We have most of what we need, but there's just a few details missing, I think, to sort of see a wider picture on this. Now, what I'd like to dub the schism is the gap between the official narrative and the counter narrative, because if the same sources of information that you've acquired are the same, or come from the same organizations who formulated the official narrative, you'll never see outside of it, right? So in order to see and understand a counter narrative, additional information is required. So that's what I call the schism. So in this part of the presentation, I'm going to fill you in on the schism, and then we'll be able to go on to the counter narrative because we'll know that's just that missing bit of information. Now, before jumping into the way that the new COVID-19 vaccines work, I'd like to just do a little refresher on how vaccines normally work. I think most people have a pretty good understanding of the way a vaccine is supposed to work, and I think it'd be fair to assume that that's how these new vaccines work as well, but it's not how they work at all, which we will get into in a few minutes. But just going to do a quick refresher on the way the vaccines normally work. Now, usually an inactivated sample of a virus or bacteria is taken. In the case of a virus, it's already dead. You can't have a dead virus, but you can remove some of its genes, which make it sort of inactive or unable to replicate itself in any sort of serious way. In a bacteria, you can just use a dead bacteria. This is sort of isolated, and then it's administered intravenously into the bloodstream. And this is an extracellular medium, right? This is outside of the cellular wall, the cellular membrane. Keep that in mind for this part, because so far all vaccines that have ever existed and worked have been based on extracellular immunization. Now, once this inactivated virus or bacteria has entered the blood, then the antigens on the surface of the virus or the bacteria identified as unique. So what happens is your body will find corresponding antibodies which match the antigens on the virus or bacteria, and then memory T cells in your lymph nodes will sort of remember the corresponding antibody to the antigen. This way, next time you're infected with the same virus, with the real virus or the real bacteria, then you'll have these memory T cells recognize them right away, and you'll already know how to make the antibodies for it. So, simple enough, right? So what makes this vaccine actually different, right? What makes these new COVID-19 vaccines different? Now, all these companies, Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson recently are trying to get approved. They've all started to talk about what the vaccine actually is. And they seem to have unanimously agreed on this messenger RNA vaccine. Now, this is completely different than any vaccine that's ever been made. And you're going to understand in a few minutes in what ways it is different. But if we look at the Moderna website, they're talking about the way that messenger RNA is being used to develop a new category of medicines. So this is not even a new kind of vaccine. This is a new way to administer treatments completely. So I'm not too sure how many people have been informed about this, but this is something that I've learned about and that I think that is worth understanding, because understanding the difference between the new COVID vaccine and vaccines that have always been around it should be key in the way that people make a decision about whether or not they'd like to go through with it, right? It's really first of its kind. Now, before understanding what messenger RNA is, because that is what these vaccines, these new vaccines contain, we first have to understand the way DNA normally works. DNA sits in the nucleus of your cells, and it codes the genes that allow for your biology to be formed. And the DNA in the nucleus is like the golden record, right? Your body's pretty smart. Your body's not going to take the golden record and pass it around to, every part of the cell and then put it back, because if something is messed up along the way, then you've messed up your golden record. So really, the DNA is kept safely in the nucleus and it never leaves. So instead, of making the DNA leave the nucleus of the cell, RNA is used. So let's say a gene needs to be used. Well then, along the DNA, a strand of RNA is formed along the gene. So it's almost like a mirror copy of the gene, right? And then this RNA then separates from the DNA, and then it leaves the nucleus, right? And it leaves the nucleus as messenger RNA. Now this messenger RNA is then taken up by a ribosome, and then the ribosome reads the RNA and makes a protein from it. Now, this way, you get to use genes, right? Because a gene will really, all genes do is they code for proteins. So instead of reading the DNA and making a protein directly off of it, the RNA acts as a relay or a messenger between DNA and the ribosomes. Now it's important to note that the ribosome can't tell the difference between, your own RNA or RNA from a foreign source. And this is actually the way viruses work. A virus comes and inserts a bit of RNA that's foreign, and your ribosomes read it and produce proteins as if it was your own RNA. However, these RNA strands just produce more viruses, right? And so essentially the virus starts using your cells as a way to reproduce itself. So it's like I said, no messenger RNA is special, right? Whether RNA floating in the cytoplasm of a cell had come from your own DNA or from the cell's DNA, it makes no difference to the ribosomes if that RNA came from an external source, right? See, on the left, you have the colorful RNA. That's the cell's RNA came from the DNA. That's its own. And on the right, we have the grayscale RNA. That's a foreign source. They'll be coded the same. The ribosome will eat it up. It's like a blind photocopier. It'll just make proteins from RNA. So that's important to keep in mind because it's actually this mechanism which the new COVID vaccines rely on. So the implications of the way that these mRNA vaccines work is that given two cells, right, one of them who's had foreign RNA or foreign messenger RNA put into the cytoplasm, and another cell whose DNA has been changed, right? What is the difference in the outcome? It's not very different. I'll tell you that. Let's think about it. Let's say, the cell on the left. This one whose messenger RNA was simply inserted. Now let's say this messenger RNA is coding for a certain protein, right? We'll call it protein X. Now the ribosome will find this strand of foreign messenger RNA, it'll read it, it'll make protein X, and now protein X is found inside the cell. Now, what if we had instead added the gene, the protein X gene, to the cell's DNA? So that's the cell on the right. Well, at some point, that changed DNA is going to make some messenger RNA, which codes for protein X. It's going to leave the nucleus, and lo and behold, the ribosomes will read that messenger RNA, just like the one that was inserted directly, and make the same protein X. The only difference in this case is that once protein X is made, in the cell on the left, production stops afterwards. However, on the right, the change is permanent. It will keep making protein X forever, as long as that cell is alive, because the golden record has been changed. So in essence, artificially inserting messenger RNA into a cell is one step removed from genetic modification. And this is not said to scare anybody, right? It's just to present it factually. That we're not just inserting an inactive virus or bacteria into the bloodstream and then letting the body take care of it. We're now going directly into cells, and we're messing with intracellular mechanisms. And these mechanisms are deep enough that they are the step right before DNA, right? So this is the kind of approach that pharmaceutical companies have taken to formulate a COVID-19 vaccine. So now that we know this, we can say that I'd certify the Knowledgeometer at about 99%, right, to see the big picture. Of course, there's a little 1% we can maybe fill in here and there, but really we have most of the information we know to understand the counter-narrative. Now, in every crisis, an opportunity is yielded, okay? And then this Einstein quote, I just pulled it off, nothing special. A lot of people have said this, right? And I think this is pretty intuitive as well, right? In any situation where people are in dire need of a solution, if you can come along with that solution, you're the savior, right? You, there's an opportunity to resolve a crisis in every crisis. It's a given. And I think that all of these pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Moderna, AstraZeneca, they've all spotted this. And I don't think they've only spotted it as a way to make money, right? Like they could have just made a normal vaccine, like always, and then made a ton of money, right? I don't think that was really the opportunity. There's always reasons to make vaccines. I think the real opportunity they spotted was to try something completely brand new. And taking the first step into the first kinds of messenger RNA treatments will allow them to develop new kinds of medicines afterwards in all kinds of things, in all kinds of fields. However, that initial R&D would have been funded by this crisis. And here, coming right off of the Moderna website, saying using messenger RNA as a drug opens up a breadth of opportunities to treat and prevent disease. Messenger RNA medicines can go inside cells to direct protein production, something not possible with other drug approaches. We have the potential to treat or prevent diseases that today are not addressable, potentially improving human health and impacting lives around the world. So here we have it coming right off of the Moderna website, explaining that not only do they have the intention of using messenger RNA in this COVID-19 vaccine, but they also have the intention to take this technology further and to use it to treat other things. So I think that the real opportunity that these pharmaceutical companies are capitalizing on is the opportunity to take a risk, to take a step forward in something completely new, to know that it's all going to be paid for, and they're going to have plenty of test subjects. And you can talk about the FDA trials and all that stuff, but because of the time crunch, it really doesn't allow us the chance to see any of the long-term effects, right? Let alone all of the corners that are allowed to be cut because of the time crunch, because of the severity of the crisis, right? So these are all things to consider in any potential conflict of interest. Okay, now this part, I think the line here, true greatness is enough to propel itself. I think it's one thing for people to sort of have an intuitive sense that there might be a conflict of interest. Like, I think people can put themselves in the shoes of the big guys and I think, okay, well, maybe these guys have something to gain, so I should be careful and, make sure that there isn't too much conflict of interest. I think people can already intuitively work like that, and, it may cause them to hesitate to make an action or, usual stuff. But I think it's another thing for authorities like Dr. Fauci to be bringing this up and to saying that, an alarming number of people may be hesitating or reluctant to take an experimental, never before used vaccine treatment. And here in the clip.
Because as you well know, we've spoken about this intensively in the past, there is a general anti-science, anti-authority, anti-vaccine feeling among some people in this country, an alarmingly large percentage of people, relatively speaking.
I mean, you just have to go on Facebook. There's so many, and those groups have really penetrated social media. How are you and other members of the public health world going to get in there and counteract what they've created? All of these lies they've created over the years, how are you going to undo that?
It's not going to be easy, Elizabeth. Anyone thinks it'll be easy is not facing reality. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to require hard work, public messaging by people who they trust. They may not like a government person in a suit like me telling them, even though I will tell them. They really need to see people that they can relate to in the community, sports figures, community heroes, people that they look up to.
And so are we working on that kind of a campaign?
Oh, absolutely. We have a program right now that's going to be extensive in reaching out to the community.
Right, so we're hearing from Fauci here saying that, a lot of effort is being put on their behalf into trying to persuade people and to convince people into getting a vaccine. And I think it would be natural. I would expect people to intuitively hesitate in being an early adopter in a novel kind of, not just a novel kind of vaccine, but a novel kind of medicine at all. I think generally most, I think it's been found that about 10% of the population are early adopters, right? You got your Prius people and your electric car people getting it the first day it comes out. You got your Apple fanboys lining up, the first day. Those are the early adopters. And there are early adopters in the sort of medical health treatment sector where, the first day this vaccine will be out, you'll have 10% of people lining up, the very first hour of the day it comes out. No problem. That's how these people are. They always want to try new things. They want to be on the cutting edge. But I think most people, anyways, would be kind of reluctant to be sort of first in line to guinea pig this thing. So, again, like I said, it's one thing for people to sort of intuitively not be too sure about a whole new kind of treatment once they know about its nature. But it's a completely different thing when there are authority figures like Dr. Fauci addressing this and saying that they're putting effort and resources into counteracting this hesitancy and counteracting this, what I would think would just be a normal response to something completely new. And as far as Canada goes, this is to show the resources being pooled into making sure that the vaccine gets out there. Justin Trudeau is saying that it's simply not enough to have a vaccine discovered, not simply enough to have doses of the vaccine secured. We have to get them into people, right? So $1 billion have been put towards 414 million doses of the vaccine. And, the Canadian military is being trained and prepared to deliver, millions of doses. So we're seeing this interesting combination of something that I think would naturally generate hesitancy and uncertainty, and then a huge amount of effort and resources being pulled towards persuasion and, borderline physical enforcement. I mean, you're using military personnel to distribute this stuff. And I'm not trying to say that they will be physically forced upon us, but it's just to say that, they could have taken 500,000 people from, the Department of Finances or whatever, for all I care. But a lot of personnel are being directed towards this effort, fully assuming that everybody's going to go with it, that this is the way to go. And I just find that combination interesting, and that it's not very much being discussed. So in summary, we have a global crisis which requires a global solution. You've got this global epidemic, it's spread everywhere. There have been global lockdowns to try and dampen the blow of the global epidemic, and these lockdowns have caused all kinds of damage to the economy. And so we need a lockdown. To have a lockdown cure, we need a COVID cure, right? We need this global solution to bring everything back to normal. And this need for a solution has opened up an opportunity, which pharmaceutical companies have spotted very well. And I think naturally there's this reluctance to jump into an experimental cure by the general population. And this reluctance has been noted. It's been noted by people like Dr. Fauci. It's been noted by other authority figures, and they're anticipating this sort of reluctance. And resources are being invested and pulled towards counteracting it. And I'm hearing no mention of the fact that this treatment is completely experimental. That not only is the nature of the vaccine, but its use as a medicine, right? Like the messenger RNA being used in a medicine at all is completely experimental and new. I've seen no mention of the fact that the immunization being obtained is intracellular, right? It's not through the traditional means of memory T cells and the sort of the antibodies antigen pathway that is normally used. And so remember back to the extracellular mechanism. It's now completely intracellular. I've also seen no room for discussion of alternatives, right? It's not like we're being presented, well, Pfizer and Moderna, these guys are working on the experimental vaccine, so if you guys want the new stuff, you can go see them. But here are some other companies who are making a more traditional vaccine. For those of you who'd rather go with a more conservative approach, that's not being presented at all. It's not even being discussed. And it almost seems like not only is there no alternative, but authority figures are doubling down on the messenger RNA efforts, right? Exclusively talking about the success rate of those companies, exclusively talking about the release of those vaccines and purchasing exclusively those vaccines. So anyway, I hope you found this presentation interesting. I hope you found it at least enlightening to sort of alternative angle to the situation, and that's hopefully given you a bit more of a 3D perspective on what's going on. My last slides here, I have a couple sources, not too many. Of course, like I said, if anything kind of left you scratching your head or doubtful, please do your research, do some homework, and try and fill in those gaps. But hopefully in this video, I just sort of gave you a little glimpse of what might be out there, and so I welcome you to try and invite what might be out there.